Just had a few more join. All right, hello again and welcome to April's Cyber Briefing. I'm Lauren Frickel, your marketing manager here at CynergisTek. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly go over a bit of housekeeping. There are a few buttons on the left side of the screen that we'll use today. Please use the chat button with the little chat bubbles to engage in conversation with the entire group. For example, if you see a colleague or a peer in the audience that you'd like to say hi, please do that there. We'll also be using the Q&A button to post your questions. We have planned for a Q&A segment at the very end of this session. As a heads up, this briefing is being recorded and will be available to stream here in this Eventry platform by the end of the day. And we will drop a link to the cyber briefing lobby in the chat so you can bookmark it to easily access past and future cyber briefing recordings and sessions. So before I turn the mic over, I ask that our audience remain muted. Keep your cameras off until we get to the Q&A segment. During the Q&A segment, please feel free to engage on camera or on the mic if you'd feel like it. So to begin, Mac, welcome. I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and welcome everybody to our event today. Lauren, just for my memory, is Sophia moving the slides or am I doing it?
Yep, Sophia is. You can just say next slide.
Okay. So there's the old guy. So as many of you know, this is the second of our monthly cyber briefings that we're going to be providing going forward. We took a lot of input from our last one, which was very helpful, and I appreciate that from all of you. I would like to encourage everybody who's on today to do that again, because one of the things that we would like to do is make these as useful as possible to the audience. And so one of the things that helps us do that, of course, is your feedback. And we will change the format up from time to time based on feedback that we get, just to make sure that it continues to stay relevant and covers topics that are of interest to you. So Sophia, would you go to the next slide, please? I'm going to do a brief threat overview because I think it's important for us to keep in top of mind the environment that we're in, and this is one of the parts of the briefing that we will update as this was from last time, but there are some things that are obviously will be repetitive because they stay relevant. And then following me, you're going to have two really great speakers, Dave Bailey, who's the head of our cyber security services, who's going to talk about a particular topic. And then you're going to have Andrew Mahler, who's the head of our privacy services, who will cover another topic. So we're going to mix it up today a little bit about, some of it's going to be background, which is what I'm going to give. And then the two of them, we're going to talk about two current issues that maybe hopefully will be helpful to some of you on the call today. And then once we're done with that, we'll follow up and allow you to ask any of us questions. Next slide. So I think we all understand that healthcare has a big target on its back. We have a lot of information. We have a lot of systems. Our business is what I would call a data critical business in that what we do every day relies on those systems and that data. Unfortunately, we are way behind with respect to our investment on the cybersecurity side as it relates to other industries and the threat in general. And we have an ever expanding attack surface that includes not only remote workers now as a result of the changes that came about through COVID, but third-party providers, cloud vendors, you name it. Basically, we have a tremendous amount of our data that is not within our four walls. It's something that's provided by somebody else, or a service that's provided by somebody else, or some service that we rely on from someone else to be able to do the things that we do. And that in and of itself creates a major risk from a disruption perspective, which is one of the things that we are very concerned about. And as we work with our clients, we recommend that they dust off their business continuity plans for certain and their disaster recovery, and that they do what we call immersive exercises to help make sure that they've got that muscle memory to be able to respond when something untoward happens. But unfortunately, we still have less than a fourth of our hospitals in America who actually conduct what we call immersive exercises, meaning an exercise where you go beyond the simulating the short outage and actually simulate an outage that's going to last for 2 to 3 weeks and require you to actually go back to very basic processes to get things done. So it's just something that this is where we are, and unfortunately it's created a great deal of risk for us as an industry. Next slide. And that disruption that I talk about is real, right? Almost 100% of our hospitals have been impacted in the last couple of years with one attack or another that has created some form of disruption. That disruption has cost us a tremendous amount of money that could be better utilized on other things such as care. But more importantly, the disruption that we're seeing today isn't just costing us money or causing hardship for our IT groups as they have to respond to these things, but it's actually affecting the quality of care and our mortality rates. And that's probably even a bigger reason for why we need to be more vigilant than ever and invest more in what we're doing to protect our data and to protect our systems. Next slide. Yeah, we look at the threat profile that we face today. It couldn't get much higher than what we have. We have a dedicated threat who has the capability and the resources and the wherewithal and the motivation to come after us. And they've demonstrated that through attacks over and over again. And the bottom line is that our adversary is real, he's motivated, and he's out there to take our treasure through manipulating or disrupting our services or affecting our data. Next slide. The leaks as it relates to data continue. They haven't abated, which is also an issue from a privacy perspective, which we also are concerned about on the healthcare side. And we'd like to think that the numbers would have at some points gone down, but unfortunately they have actually started to rise in the last 3 years. And a lot of it's because of the ransomware attacks that we're having today. They're not just encrypting data. The first thing they're doing is exfiltrating that data because they want to be able to extort you in multiple ways. They want to extort you in terms of the disruption of the system. They want to extort you in terms of getting your data back. They want to extort you with respect to not releasing your data on the dark web, et cetera, et cetera. So they are using multiple levers to extort organizations, and data is just one of those now. Next slide. When you look at the number of attacks that we've seen over time, you notice that we had very few of those attacks in the early years in 2000. A lot of that was because they didn't have a way to monetize the payments. In 2013, cryptocurrency came along and allowed them to monetize the process of receiving payments anonymously without getting caught. And from there, we just started going up. We are now kind of sort of at a plateau, but we're at a very high plateau where we're seeing hundreds of these attacks a day, thousands of these attacks that are successful across the country in any given year. And unfortunately, we in healthcare suffer at least half of these attacks. And unfortunately, we suffer about half of the attacks overall across the globe. Healthcare is absolutely the most attacked industry that we have out there right now as it relates to extortive attacks. Next slide. You look at the threat actors that are out there, and a lot of the threat hunters and the folks that do monitoring and analysis are tracking these folks. These are organizations that are known to engage in cybercrime or cyber criminal activities. There's roughly today somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 of these folks or organizations out there that are engaged in this kind of activity. Almost 200 of those, or 80% of them, are focused on the United States. And if you look at the top 10 of any one of these, they're focused on healthcare. And it just, when you think about it, from any given day, there are literally dozens of organizations that are looking to compromise your environment, to extort your data. And there are literally hundreds of different families of ransomware that are active at any given day on the internet that could potentially affect you. Next slide. When you look at the threat intelligence report from last year, one of the things that CISA did in conjunction with the FBI and NSA was put together in the UK, was put together a study that took a look at all of the ransomware attacks across the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, and looked at the trends that came out of those attacks in order to perhaps learn something from what we're seeing out there. Clearly, phishing and RDP attacks are still very big, but also are exploiting vulnerabilities, meaning things that aren't patched, things that aren't configured properly, things that aren't closed, or things that shouldn't be enabled. Basically looking for those mistakes that we make in our environment that allow them to get that foothold, if you will, and then to exploit from there. We now have cyber criminal service for hire, which means I don't even have to know what I'm doing. I just have to know how to get to it on the dark web and hire somebody to do it for me. Probably one of the biggest things that came out of last year that I think is most alarming is that now the attackers are beginning to share victim information. So you may be attacked by one group, but then they may share what they learn about you with all the other groups in the dark web. And so now all of a sudden you become potentially a target by many different folks, as opposed to just the folks who initially attacked you. I talked about how they're diversifying their extortion activities in terms of the multiple ways that they can extort through data, through disruption, through leakage, etc. And that's making it even more difficult to deal with these folks. And then last but not least, we know for a fact that they're beginning to attack industrial processes and supply chains, which is really important because as our attack surface has expanded, we now have a lot of folks that are providing critical services to us. And when those folks get disrupted, then we get disrupted. So think Kronos, think Kaseya, think those kinds of attacks, think Colonial Pipeline, and all of a sudden you can see the collateral damage that one of those attacks can cause in any industry and in ours as well. Next slide. So with that, the good news, of course, is that ransomware will be on the rise in 2022. Actually, that's not good news, but we don't see any abatement of this kind of activity. We see the types of ways that they will extort to continue to multiply. We are seeing more aggressive tactics with respect to data destruction and information leakage, attacking high value individuals, a lot of whale fishing, if you will, and focusing on individuals, senior individuals in the organization. We see them modifying how they do encryption to make it even harder for us to detect by encrypting disk drives, if you will, or storage as opposed to data itself. The cloud is becoming a much larger target than before because we are moving more and more data to the cloud, and the attackers tend to follow what we do. So as we go to the cloud, they're going to go to the cloud right behind us. 90% of the breaches that we've seen in the cloud in 2022 are the results of misconfigurations and mistakes by users, same thing that we see in environments on-prem. A lot of the applications that we see out there, whether they're web applications, cloud applications, etc., have vulnerabilities that are associated with them that haven't been addressed. And we see a lot of those applications that haven't been tested as well as they should have been, or APIs that perhaps haven't been tested. and last but not least, again, we see more and more attacks against the supply chain. So the bottom line is we have to think, when we think about threat and we think about risk, we have to think outside the box, meaning we have to think outside our four walls. We have to think about everywhere we do business and everywhere we share data and every system or every service that's critical to our operations. Next slide. You know, the other thing too that I would encourage folks to do is make sure that when you have an incident, that one, I hope that you have all of your responses, plans, if you will, dusted off and are familiar with them. I hope that one of the first people you're going to contact is law enforcement, and as well as your insurance provider, to make sure that you get the support that you need in that situation as quickly as possible. And I think the thing that you need to understand and take to heart is that the folks at the FBI and law enforcement are absolutely there to help you. You're the victim in this scenario. They recognize that, and their approach to this is to be an asset and a resource to you. And for instance, if you look at the Kaseya breach that happened last year, you know, the FBI, fortunately, because of some other work that they had done, were able to come in there and essentially save them and get them back up and running without them having to pay the ransom, which was pretty sizable in their case, $70 million, which is amazing. There's a link here on this slide. I'm assuming we're going to make the slides available to you. This was an AHA interview that was done on the University of Vermont breach that occurred in 2020. And this is both John Riggi at AHH, who is the former FBI agent, who is now the senior security guy for the American Hospital Association, and a couple of executives from the University of Vermont who are talking about this event and what happened and what worked well and what didn't. And it's a great listen if you've not heard it or if you've not been able to sit through an after action or a debrief on a major ransomware case that created a lot of disruption. So I encourage you to get this and listen to it. Next slide. And the last thing is, as you heard me talk about before, you know, I absolutely believe that we have got to change our approach. That being defensive and reactive is not going to take care of us going forward. We have to become more proactive in our cyber posture. We have to develop architectures and invest in the technologies that allow us to be better at predicting and anticipating where the threat may attack us. And being able to actually recognize when something is going on that is not appropriate. I think the other thing we need to do is really seriously take to heart the zero trust model, meaning you don't trust anybody until proven trustworthy, whether it's internal or external. Because the bottom line is, as I've said, the threat's coming for your data and they're coming for your money. And they are not going to stop, and they are going to be absolutely relentless. So take a page out of Chesty Puller's book. He's the colonel that was surrounded with a Marine regiment at the Chosin Reservoir in the Korean conflict, surrounded by 5 Chinese divisions. Everybody thought he was going to go into a defensive posture, and if he had, he probably would have had his entire regiment wiped out. But instead, Chesty Puller said, you know what? I'm going to do what they don't expect. I'm going to attack. And he did, and he took out 2 of those Chinese divisions as he got his regiment out of that reservoir and back to safety. So be Chesty Puller. Don't sit there and wait for the bad guys to come to you. Go to them. Make sure that you are pushing back, and that you know what's going on, and that you have control of your environment, and don't let them get the upper hand. Next slide. So last but not least, I think it's always, right now, we need to continue to be vigilant with respect to what's going on over in Ukraine. That is far from over, as we all know. And there have been all kinds of threats and whatnot and activity with respect to cyber warfare as it relates to Ukraine from Russia, and hopefully that won't spread over to here, but you never know. And so one of the things that we need to do is be incredibly diligent and pay attention to the alerts that are coming out from the Health ISAC, that are coming out from the FBI and from CISA. Make sure that you're reading those things and looking in what they're telling you to go look at, to make sure that you don't have those risks, or that you've at least addressed those things. Next slide. Right, so the need for vigilance remains high with respect to this issue. This is where you can go. There's a link here that you can go to on the CISA site that you can pull up all of their alerts and read those. And you can go to the Shields Up part of their website to learn more. But bottom line is, if you haven't looked at this stuff, you probably should be looking at it. Next slide. And what can you do now? Well, for one, you can get a better handle on what your environmental footprint looks like. Have somebody look at what you look like in the dark web. What does the threat actually know about you? What credentials are already compromised out there that perhaps you need to change? Make sure that your public-facing vulnerabilities have been addressed with respect to web applications and patching systems that perhaps are not up to date as well as they should be, or systems that are beyond service. Make sure we address those things. Right, secure your credentials, deploy multi-factor authentication or a privileged access management solution. Make sure that they can't get a hold of those privileges that they can use against you in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of things here that you can take a look at, just things that you should be thinking about doing if you haven't done them, and making sure that you are ready in the event that something happens. Next slide. Okay. So with that, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Bailey, who's going to talk about the first topic in cybersecurity, and then he's going to hand it off to Andrew Mahler, who's going to talk about a topic in compliance and privacy. So Dave, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Yeah, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm Dave Bailey, Vice President of Security Services, and glad I could be here today to talk about the topic. Certainly the theme when time matters. My topic is driven by a recent article that came out from Dark Reading in the end of March. And it was looking at the speed of 10 of the common ransomware families. So I wanted to really show the results of what those speeds look like. I think it's important to understand where encryption falls on the attack chain. What are the assumptions if you're at the point where your organization has encrypted files? And unfortunately, one of those assumptions is that if you're at the point of encryption, all of the safeguards that you have in place in order to prevent those things did fail at that point, and hopefully be able to leave you with some key focus areas that you can, look at your program wherever you are in the maturity of that program, and take some of these takeaways and try to implement change and certainly mitigate the risk. Go ahead, next slide, please. So the article that Dark Reading came out about ransomware was actually a study that was done by Splunk. And Splunk looked at 10 common ransomware families. The families of ransomware are down there along that line. The study was done with 100,000 files, 54 gigabytes of data, and in common infrastructure. And what I mean by common infrastructure, most of them in standard, Windows server environments, storage environments, as well as some virtualization, some physical. So they looked at what it would take to how long it would take these ransomware families to encrypt. So overall, the study produced that if you looked at all 10, the average median from all 10 families was 42 minutes. So it took 42 minutes on average for those ransomware families to encrypt 100,000 files, 54 gigabytes of data. The winner of the study was Lockbit Ransomware. It did it in 5 minutes and 50 seconds. So that's a really tremendous speed when it comes to the amount of data that it can encrypt. If you look at healthcare, and if you see where, over the last 14, 15, 16 months, the common threat actors that have really highlighted the healthcare industry have been, and the ransomware families that have impacted have been Riot ransomware, and you can see Riot came in at 14 minutes and 30 seconds, and Conti ransomware, which took an hour. When I started looking at this, and I really wanted to say, okay, what does this really mean to an organization? If you think about your infrastructures and where data lives and how your organization functions from an IT service delivery perspective, do you have the ability to minimize the impact once you're at that detonation point? And one of the key things that came out is if you look at the threat intelligence reports that CISA has released, it came out end of last year that the organizations were focusing their attacks on holidays and weekends. And one of the reasons why I think that's the case is it falls in line with these speeds. You would normally think if I'm a threat actor, I want to start this detonation when I have the least amount of staff being able to respond to it. And, I can provide the most impact from a denial of service standpoint once that ransomware starts to detonate. So as you can see, the best one on the list was 5 minutes over that 100,000 files. And then the worst one was almost 2 hours. And like I said, I really want to highlight the Riot and Conti, because those seem to be the two families that are impacting the healthcare industry the most. Next slide, please. All right, so by the time they encrypt, is it too late? I wanted to lay out briefly, where does the encryption fall on the attack chain? So the entry point for a ransomware attack primarily still comes from phishing. It means that someone in your organization clicked or opened up a Word or PDF document. Once that Word or PDF document was opened, some malware family, either TrickBot, Cobalt Strike, was then downloaded, installed on the inside of the network. Once that occurs, there'd be a threat actor that then uses that malwares with their tactics, tools, and techniques, and they spend some time inside your environment, and they're looking for credentials. They're doing discovery. They're seeing basically where they can cause the most damage to your environment. Once they have completed all that and they get to a point where they feel they can achieve their goal, and the ultimate goal at this stage from the threat actor is to be able to successfully extort the organization for money. They'll exfiltrate the data, and then they'll detonate the ransom. At that particular point, there'll be, usually organizations will see that through two means: through a known denial of service, because once the files are encrypted, then systems and processes will have a hard time operating or functioning, or if it is not as widespread at the point of encryption, the users will see a message that'll identify that they've been succumbed to the ransomware. Next slide. All right, so what are those assumptions? So the assumption, if you were at the point of detonation, is that your organization was successfully targeted and phished. What that means is that some level of reconnaissance was done on the organization, a phishing campaign was crafted, someone in the organization then clicked the link or opened up the Word or PDF document. The other assumption you want to make from that is that the threat actor spent, right now, the average dwell time for ransomware is around 5 days. in the network. This number is changing. I've read some different numbers. I know Mandiant produced a report specifically on a threat actor group called Fin12, and the RIAC group was spent about an average of 5.7 days inside the network. So this can certainly change. It's an up or down number, but the assumption that you can make if you were encrypted is that there was a threat actor that spent on average 5 days inside your organization undetected. The other assumption you can make is credentials were compromised. Part of this process is to identify accounts, to harvest those accounts, and then ultimately be able to do things like privilege escalation and do discovery throughout your network. The other assumption you have to make is that data was exfiltrated. So at the point that the message is there, their notification to you is usually, we have your data, this is how you contact us, and from that point, then you can follow the instructions and start the negotiation process with the threat actors. And then from this point, at least one, possibly two extortion attempts are expected. So as it stands right now, there could be extortion to not expose your data because they have exfiltrated it. There could be extortion for the keys, and even in some cases, there's talk and discussion about other levels of distortion around business partners and other areas. So that's where Mac had mentioned earlier in the briefing that different levels of extortion may occur. But at least at this stage of the game, we know at least one, possibly two extortion attempts are expected. Go ahead, next slide. All right, what to do? So now that we talked about what can happen and what the assumptions are and what the impact is to the speed of that ransomware encryption, I want to focus on three areas. So the first thing I'm going to do is the must-dos. Matt mentioned about having to really change focus and perspective. I've been in security for a very long time, and I don't know of a time since the late 90s that I've been doing cybersecurity that there isn't this understanding that to build a security program, you have to have a strong program, you have to do risk assessments, you have to put all the safeguards in place. None of that is changing. So that must-do is there. We recommend using this cybersecurity framework. We recommend looking at all of the controls and processes. You basically have to have a control that achieves its purpose and is well-defined. If you have a control that achieves its purpose and is well-defined, you can hopefully minimize the impacts to that disruption. And you can't do it today without actively managing risk. And active risk management is something that an organization has to embrace. They have to embrace what the risk tolerance is and really adjust and adapt to the threat. And as it stands right now, if anybody only falls in this first column, what we're finding is it's not enough to minimize the impacts to these disruptive attacks. What do you must do right now? Well, if you look at every recommendation that's been out, especially around ransomware over the last 18 months, and every time CISA puts out a notice on ransomware, they provide some really good advice on what you should do right now. We echo that, and I want to add to it. The first is you have to segment your networks. You have to reduce the attack surface. The more you can reduce your attack surface, the less that speed of encryption will impact your organization. Because if they can only are isolated to a smaller area of your network based upon good segmentation practices, it could minimize the impact to that exposure. In today's environment, multi-factor authentication is a must. Everything as we see today comes about through some level of account compromise. And the threat actors are looking for accounts and they're looking for that ability to gain access to your environment through some authenticated and validated mean. Because if they are authenticated and validated in your environment through a valid account, they can go undetected inside that environment. That's why multi-factor is so important. This one, I chuckle every time I hear it, because I don't think patching is a security problem. And I know somebody's going to say, what does that mean? Why is Dave saying that patching is not a security problem? I think every security professional knows that they have to patch. Patching becomes a business problem. It becomes the ability to patch, the ability to enter into some level of life cycle without business disruption. In healthcare, we deal with legacy systems and applications. We deal with maintenance contracts. We deal with biomedical devices and things that are much harder to just say, hey, the vulnerability is here, let's go patch. So I don't think I've been inside a healthcare organization over my 6 years at CynergisTek where having legacy and outdated software and challenges in patching, just based upon how you deliver care and what you have to do from a care delivery environment is a challenge. But I'll say it again, echo it again. I can't stress it enough. Patch everything. The next thing I know, which we're starting to see some improvement in a lot of the healthcare industry, but it's just not enough. Monitoring is starting to occur, but we're not monitoring everything. Everything needs to be monitored. We still have organizations with incomplete SIM implementations, only seeing a certain subset of their network of visibility, but really comes down to you have to be able to monitor everything in your environment. Go ahead, next slide. And the last thing I'll talk about is some targeted focus areas. So first thing I want to say is one of the things that can help is to monitor activity before the attack. What capabilities do you have to be able to look at what the dark web has, what profile your organization has, and certainly around your key executives, because those are the ones that generally would get targeted for those targeted phishing. You need to gain full visibility and ensure all your safeguards are in place. Validate, validate, validate. Can't stress it enough. You've made tons and tons of investments within your infrastructure. You need to be able to validate that what you have in place is working, is effective, and you need to know everything that's connected to the wire. The other thing I want to stress from an encryption standpoint is ensure that those validation steps for backups are in place. If you look at the speed of encryption and knowing that there could be a much larger denial of service and inability to just do file restores, what processes do you have in place to be able to validate that the backups that you have, or how far you need to go back in order to say that I can recover from this event and my data or my systems are not compromised or under attack based upon how far you need to go back in order to do that. So look at those validation steps as part of your backup procedures, and know that you may have to go further back than you think based upon your infrastructure, knowing that encryption has already taken place. And knowing that, so what does that mean from a determining impact for recovering critical business functions? So as you look at and you test and operate and practice and rehearse your plans, try to do it in, from the understanding that you may have to go further back in your recovery options. What does that mean to the business? What does that mean to care delivery? How do you validate that when I go back that, yes, this is the data that is valid and accurate, and I can recover and, consider myself not to be under attack and duress. So I thank you for the opportunity today. Be happy to answer any questions after Andrew's session, and would like to turn it over to Andrew.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Dave and Mac, that was great. As they mentioned, my name is Andrew Mahler. I am the Vice President of Privacy and Compliance Services, and I'm here to talk about something that is, not only near and dear to my heart as a former privacy officer, but also something that you see crop up in every privacy law, whether it's federal, state, or international. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, sometimes forget that when you think about data privacy, you're not only thinking about the governance of data, but there's also administrative rights that go along with it and individual rights that go along with these rules and laws. So this is just one of those individual rights, which is the right of access. And so I'm here to talk a bit about some of the enforcement work that OCR is doing and others are doing, and then hopefully get to a place where everybody feels comfortable about maybe after this presentation what steps they may want to take or raise internally to start making sure your organization has the posture that you want it to have or it should have. Next slide, please. So I know we've got a lot of cyber folks in the room, a lot of partners and friends that I see, and I wanted to start off with a quote that touches on cyber as well as data privacy. For those of you who don't know Alan Weston, please Google him afterwards. He's a very fascinating person who unfortunately passed away a number of years ago, but did a lot of work thinking about data privacy specifically. And this goes way back even before the 70s, but one of his seminal works, which Tim Cook has been talking about pretty frequently, and it's nice to see Dr. Weston back in the news. This is, I think, a really great quote to think about as we think about the right of access, what's collected, for what purpose, and with whom information is shared. These are matters of policy choice. It's not just technological determination. We can't avoid any of our social, moral, and I'll say at this point, regulatory responsibilities by just saying, well, we weren't able to provide access, or we weren't able to respond because the technological systems that were in place failed. There are lots of things that we can be doing along the way to make sure that we're complying with the rules and regulations, as well as making sure our patients and others understand what rights they have. Next slide, please. So the individual right of access, as I mentioned earlier, this is truly, one of, if not the most fundamental right in data protection laws around the world. You see it in a variety of federal privacy laws. So not only HIPAA, you see it crop up even in Fair Credit Reporting Act, FERPA as well. You see it in every state privacy law that's been established. So if you think about CCPA or CPRA, which is coming soon, Colorado, Virginia, and Utah, all three of which are pretty new to this space, and every single proposed law. So I went and looked at all of the proposed laws that are out there at every state, and you see some individual right of access. It's usually framed as a right to request access to data. You see it in every single proposed law. So this is something that we should all be thinking about, whether we have data that's regulated at the federal level, at the state level, or even globally. So if we have data from the EU, Brazil, Singapore, as well as a number of others. So something really to keep at the front of your mind as you're thinking about making sure your privacy program is really where it should be. So let's dive into HIPAA, because we're talking about healthcare today. So you see the individual right of access, or the right to request access, in the individual rights section of the privacy rule, which makes sense. And really what this says in a summary is that with some limited exceptions, HIPAA provides a legal enforceable right to not just request to receive, but also request to see copies of their records upon request. And in addition to that, if accepted, the organization, the covered entity, even the business associate in some cases, has to provide it in certain forms and formats as requested by the individual. So the idea here is, from really an ethical standpoint, HHS, OCR, and others are really wanting to make sure that individuals have some control over their data, and especially data about their health. Next slide, please. So that leads us to something that has been in the news a lot since 2019. OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, which for those of you who don't know, this is the agency within Health and Human Services that enforces and regulates HIPAA, so privacy, security, and breach notification, as well as some civil rights laws. And in 2019, and going back even a little bit further into 2018, OCR they were having conversations internally about enforcement efforts. And something that continued to come up over and over again was the fact that OCR was receiving all of these complaints from patients and from others that they were not getting access to their medical records. So OCR started this initiative, and it's appropriately called the Right of Access Initiative. And here you can see a couple quotes. I pulled these directly from the director of OCR, and it gives you a sense of how important this is. We know that they've said, access to health record is an essential Hipaa right. They've got healthcare providers have a legal obligation to their patients to provide access and in a timely basis. And OCR will continue these enforcement actions by holding covered entities responsible and pursue not just civil monetary penalties, which I'll talk about in a minute, but in addition to some of these monetary penalties, also corrective action plans, which requires a lot of time and resources. And there's some, again, pretty easy ways that you can get ahead of this, and I'll talk about those in just a couple slides. So what does the trending look like as part of this initiative? We know we've got 20 enforcement actions since 2019. It's quite a lot. The most recent one was just a few weeks ago, and actually, as the most recent enforcement action was released, it was 4 at the same time at the end of March. And what's interesting also about those actions that were released as part of OCR's work is that all 4 of them, 2 of them were right of access and the other 2 were strictly privacy cases. So we are seeing, concerns around data privacy continue to be looked at by OCR and regulators and continue to pop up in these enforcement actions, not only cyber. The average settlement is not low. Average settlement is $60,000. The highest is $200,000, and we've got a number of these cases that are at least $100,000 or more. So while we do have some that are lower, I think the lowest one may be about $5,000 for a smaller clinic. The bulk of these are we're seeing $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 for these penalties. And something that I want to reiterate again is that almost all of these were brought to OCR's attention by one person. So one person made a complaint, which started OCR's investigation, and it led to these penalties. So in these cases, we're not talking about 500 or more records being breached or having some sort of large incident. These are really one individual who's raising this concern. So that's how sensitive some of this can be. Next slide, please. A few assumptions and case examples, and I'll go through these pretty quickly so we can talk about some things to be thinking about. These are assumptions that I hear pretty frequently, and I have conveniently here put the assumption along with the dollar amount that OCR has penalized these organizations for as part of these assumptions. One is, well, we own the medical records, so we have complete control over the data. We know already that's not true. It's part of every privacy law, including HIPAA. The first one, we can deny access to someone who isn't the patient, including deceased patients, and minors. We have a couple examples of that as part of this initiative, one of which $80,000. Another assumption, we can deny access if the patient wants us to send their records to a third party, $75,000. So in this case, it was, OCR was receiving a lot of requests actually from law firms who were saying, this patient has wanted to send their records to us and they haven't. So some of these complaints were brought by the patient along with their law firm or their attorney. We can take the time we need to locate and confirm the records requested. That was $32,000. So this was an organization that took too much time to get back and respond to the individual. We can make somebody come to the office and pick up the records in person. I saw this a lot when I worked at OCR. A lot of organizations would say, well, we don't feel comfortable emailing or mailing records, so somebody has to come in person and pick them up because that's the safest way for us to give them their data. And not only do we know that's not true because there's lots of incidents that happen when patients get the wrong paperwork, but it also creates a huge ethical and moral issue because not everybody has the ability to travel, right? Not everybody has the ability to go down to where their clinic or hospital is and pick up records. We don't have to respond if the requester isn't the patient, even if they're requesting on behalf of the patient. This was the largest dollar amount, and this again goes back to an attorney working with a patient to get their records. We can deny requests for images like MRIs and X-rays because those are too expensive to copy, $100,000. And then finally, this one was interesting. There was a request for a copy of a patient's driver's license that was part of the medical record, which I think many of us would say, well, that's not really maybe part of a designated record set or part of a record, but in fact it was, and they were penalized $10,000. So you can see here, these are all within the past couple years. OCR is clear that they're going to continue to investigate these issues and penalize groups that are not compliant. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we do about this? Knowing that many of these are brought by a single person, many of these, are brought because, maybe there was somebody in HIM or somebody at the front desk that didn't understand the policy. Maybe there was a backlog of requests because maybe there was a very large set of requests that came in for a certain reason. So there's things that we can start doing now. And I would say the big picture perspective is we want to ultimately audit the process. We want to do some sort of a compliance review where we have, internally, externally, we have somebody come through and pretend to be a patient, and we do some sort of a random sampling to see, how long it takes to get the records, what the response is from HIM or from medical records, and how that's processed. We want to do these audits or compliance assessments in a way that, it really reflects how patient requests come in. So they may come in and ask for something to be emailed to them. They may ask for their records to be mailed to them. And we need to make sure that we can comply with those requirements. So this is really taking a look at your policies, looking at your right of access policies, looking at your medical records and HIM policies, examine what the practices are. So do the practices line up with what the policies say? And do the policies and practices clearly state the timelines that require a response and when and how an organization has to comply, and when in some cases they might even be able to deny access. There are some carve-outs in the privacy rule as well for an organization to deny access. So all of these things, whether it's looking at unreasonable measures, the form and format of access, timeliness, fees. So what are we charging people to have access to their records, having information sent to third parties, in denial. These are some of the top areas that, if I'm a privacy officer, compliance officer, counsel, or even in the information security office, I'm going to want to be thinking about these bold items because these are the areas where things tend to go south the fastest and tend to raise more angst and frustration from patients when they get a response back that isn't okay, here are your records. So really important to take a hard look at your policies, your practices, and your templates. And with that, I think I turn it over to Mac or to Lauren for any questions and answers. Really happy to be talking with you, and always happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
So thank you, Andrew and Dave, for that. And I noticed we had a great session going on the side here with Mr. Dignam from Virtua in the chat. If any of you looked at that, I tried to get some of the rest of you engaged there, but I wasn't successful. But you might want to take a look. Oh, there's Mr. Leroy just popped in. Lauren, do we have any? I know we don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, but Lauren, do we have any questions that came in?
Yeah, just confirming you can hear me.
I can.
Mr. Leroy has asked if we can discuss and recommend crowdsourced threat sources.
Okay. Dave, would you and Andrew like to pop back in so you can participate? Dave, that's really a question I'd like to punt over to you.
Yeah, I'm going to just read it here real quick. Vulnerabilities.
So Dave, Mr. Leroy has a few different questions. So first, he's wondering if we can discuss or recommend any crowdsourced threat sources. He currently uses HISAC, Twitter, and some other feeds, but looking for some notable recommendations that maybe you use or could recommend.
Yeah, no, it is. This is an excellent question from a threat perspective. I don't know if I would say there is a wrong answer to it, other than, access to what we believe is reputable and or I think are good sources. Certainly, HISAC is an excellent source. I believe InfraGard is an excellent source because it summarizes how the FBI and CISA and the federal agencies can take information and turn it into actionable intelligence or information around that. I would also say that, certainly some of the, leading, product vendors that deal with EDR, incident response, and others that have active threat intelligence feeds that I think it's important to see what, those threat actors are doing, and you can receive those through your EDR, technologies as well as access into, some of the tools and capabilities that are providing your blocking and tackling with inside your organization. But I would say the things that you listed are appropriate. And what I think the challenge is how you have to, invest time, as you said, into determining whether it's actionable intelligence. It's one thing to have the information, but how you turn that into actionable intelligence. And yes, you do need a process to at least evaluate it and know how does that information impact my organization. And the quicker you can know what your assets are in your organization, know what you have to protect, what safeguards you have in place, the quicker you can evaluate whether this particular vulnerability or threat that's out there could potentially have an impact in the organization.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Andrew, are you there?
I am, yes.
So there's a question here from Mr. Hartman. It says, how much time with interoperability does the covered entity have to provide the patient real-time access to documents in a patient portal, for example, labs and test results?
That is a very good question. Let me pull up my notes here on the information blocking rule. I want to say it is 30 days. Let me confirm that before I tell somebody something differently.
But he's talking about real-time access here. You're talking, is
Oh,
that?
I'm sorry.
So he's talking about a portal.
He's
When somebody goes to a portal,
Sure.
let's say I'm a patient. I've had a lab test run. And I go to my portal, my patient portal, and the lab test isn't there, right?
Yeah.
How long does the covered entity have to actually post results of lab tests to a portal to meet the requirement?
It's again, really, really good question. I don't know that I have the answer to that right now, but what we can do, I can make sure we get it to you if at least if ONC has clarified that, and I think that they have, but it may be in a recent, it may be in one of their more recent guidance publications. I will make sure we get that to you and can update folks here.
Okay, so Terry will research that and get you that answer, and we'll publish it to everybody that was on today as well. Either that or Andrew will cover it in the next monthly discussion. Okay.
Mac, if I may, I want to add, as I was catching up with the dialogue in the chat, specifically to Lou, around the Microsoft and automatic patching. I think certainly there's going to be a balance between capability and timing. And timing, I think, of patching, certainly if executed properly, can benefit the organization. But I would say making sure that the awareness and integration into change management, as well as whatever life cycle and notice with the business and others, I think will introduce some some challenges there. Certainly whenever we use the word automatic, because yes, you will have to have the ability to roll back. You will have to be able to still test and know that you're going to have some impact to to systems and the way they function based upon patching. So. I would say the better the change management and testing practices are in place, the easier that will be to implement.
Yeah, but it, like everything else, you know, risk is relative, right? And risk is predicated on the likelihood of it happening and the impact when it does. So at some point, you're going to have to take a look at, you know, is the likelihood of a major issue or some disruptive issue and the impact of that in terms of cost far outweigh the ability to avoid the major cyber attack? And that's a good question. And I'm glad Lou brought that topic up, because it's certainly something that organizations are going to have to work through. Well, listen, thanks everybody for coming today. We ran a couple minutes over, but I want to try to keep to the time. Thank you for the questions there at the end. And please give us feedback on our cyber brief, and let us know what we can do to continue to improve it. We'd like for this to be as much of an interactive discussion as possible. And we want to modify it until we get it to a point where it's something that all of you are actually engaged in and enjoying and getting some value out of. So please give us your feedback. We look forward to talking to you again at our next event in May. And thank you.